This is the special topic on PREMIS, the Preservation Metadata Implementation Strategy Standard, presented by Kari Smith, Global Archivist. An overview. The PREMIS Data Dictionary for Preservation Metadata is the international de facto standard for metadata to support the preservation of digital objects and ensure their long-term usability. Developed by an international team of experts, PREMIS is applied and used in digital preservation projects around the world, and support for PREMIS is incorporated into a number of commercial and open-source digital preservation tools and systems. The PREMIS Data Dictionary and the documentation and data models provide comprehensive practical information for how to use and record preservation metadata in digital archiving systems. The data dictionary is built on a data model that defines 5 entities: objects, environments, events, rights, and agents. The PREMIS Editorial Committee coordinates revisions and implementations of the standard, which consists of the data dictionary, an XML schema, and supporting documentation. These are hosted by the U.S. Library of Congress as the PREMIS maintenance activity. This overview uses a selection of extracts from the PREMIS 3.0 documentation to explain and illustrate the purpose, components, and use of PREMIS. PREMIS resources. The Library of Congress Maintenance Activity website is where the PREMIS resources are maintained and updated. There are several items that together provide the suite of PREMIS resources: the data dictionary, XML schema and OWL ontology, PREMIS conformance guidance, supporting documentation such as presentation slides, tutorials, and examples, and information about the PIG listserv for the PREMIS Implementers Group Forum. PREMIS and OAIS. The current version of PREMIS is 3.0, updated November 2015. PREMIS builds upon the OAIS reference model and defines implementable core preservation metadata. PREMIS is implementation independent. That is, it does not concern itself with how metadata is stored, but only with what a repository should know, and therefore defines semantic units, metadata that a repository should know, rather than metadata elements, a specific way of encoding metadata. The PREMIS Data Dictionary does not include metadata elements that are already described by other metadata schema, such as within technical or descriptive metadata standards. The PREMIS Data Dictionary is a comprehensive practical resource for implementing preservation metadata in digital preservation systems. The data dictionary defines preservation metadata as data that supports the viability, renderability, understandability, authenticity, and identity of digital objects in a preservation context, and represents the information most preservation repositories need to know to preserve digital materials over the long run. The data dictionary emphasizes implementable metadata, that is, metadata that can be acted upon by computer programs and tools. These should be well defined, supported by guidelines for creation, management, and use, and oriented towards automated workflows. And embodies technical neutrality, so no assumptions are made by PREMIS about preservation technologies, strategies, metadata storage, and management. Definitions. As a standard for preservation metadata, the PREMIS Data Dictionary for Preservation Metadata is based on a data model that defines the entities that are described, the properties of those entities, semantic units, and the relationships between them. Semantic units are the metadata that a repository should know or have, and each unit belongs to one of 5 entities. Metadata elements provide specific ways of encoding metadata. Preservation metadata is the information a repository uses to support the digital preservation process. Core preservation metadata is the metadata that most repositories will likely need to know in order to perform digital preservation. please note here that the word core as used here is not necessarily the same as mandatory. Implementable core preservation metadata means that it is rigorously defined as in the PREMIS Data Dictionary, supported by usage guidelines, and has an emphasis on automated workflows. A key factor in putting preservation metadata into action is whether the values can be automatically supplied and automatically processed by the repository. Whenever possible, the PREMIS authors defined semantic units that do not require human intervention to supply or analyze. For example, controlled values from an authority list are preferred over textual descriptions. Example in the Data Dictionary. This is an image from the PREMIS Data Dictionary. It shows how the semantic units are described, what information needs to be recorded, and examples of values. For the fixity semantic unit, there are three components that together record the necessary metadata needed for fixity. One of them is message digest algorithm. As you can see in this example, the message digest algorithm is also described and provides the information needed to record it using PREMIS. Encoding PREMIS metadata. PREMIS metadata can be encoded using XML. This means that anyone who is putting their preservation metadata into a repository will be using the same way to format and structure it. This helps with consistency, automation, and the ability to share preservation metadata with other repositories because they both use the common method of defining and recording metadata. Looking at this example, we can see how fixity is encoded using PREMIS XML schema with the three semantic components, message digest algorithm, message digest, and message digest originator. The PREMIS data model. The data dictionary is built on a data model that defines 5 entities that are important in regard to digital preservation activities. These are objects, environments, events, right statements, and agents. Each semantic unit defined in the data dictionary is a property of one of the entities in the data model. For the PREMIS data model, boxes represent entities and arrows represent relationships between the entities. The arrow indicates the direction of the relationship as recorded in the metadata. Object entity. These are what the repository actually preserves. There are 4 different types of objects: file stream, representation, bit stream, or intellectual entity. In our previous example, the semantic unit fixity is a property of the object entity. Starting with PREMIS version 3.0, object entities can be used to capture environments that are relevant to the content of the repository. Like content objects, environments can be described at all content category levels, such as intellectual entity, representation, file, and bitstream. Intellectual entity is a coherent set of content that is described as a unit. For example, a book, a map, a photograph, or a serial publication. An intellectual entity can include other intellectual entities. For example, a website can include a web page, and a web page can include a photograph. An intellectual entity may have one or more representations. The environment entity. This describes technology, software, or hardware supporting a digital object in some way, such as rendering or execution. Environments can be described as intellectual entities and captured and preserved in the preservation repository as representations, files, and/or bit streams. Intellectual entities are used to record descriptive information for an environment. With the advent of intellectual entities in PREMIS 3.0, the way in which environments are modeled in PREMIS has been transformed. Before version 3.0, there was an environment container within an object that described the environment supporting that object. If a non-environment object needs to refer to an environment, it is now recommended that the environment is described as an object in its own right, and the two objects are linked with a dependency relationship. The entity event. An event which is an action that involves or affects at least one object or agent associated with or known by the preservation repository. Events aggregate metadata about actions, containing metadata such as the event identifier, event type, creation or migration, and other event details. The agent entity. An agent is a person, organization, or software program or system associated with the events in the life of an object, or with rights attached to an object. Agents can have different roles in relation to an event or to objects. They can, for example, be persons, organizations, or programs. They can contain an identifier and possibly other information like a name or a type. The rights statements entity. This describes rights and permissions specifically related to digital preservation. Recap: what PREMIS is and is not. PREMIS is a common data model for thinking about and organizing preservation metadata. You can use the data dictionary as a checklist for core metadata in a repository and the PREMIS guidance for local implementations. It is also a standard for exchanging information packages between repositories. PREMIS does not, however, provide all the metadata necessary for curation and preservation of digital archives. It excludes business rules, format-specific technical metadata, descriptive metadata for access, and non-core preservation metadata. Moreover, it doesn't provide all the metadata needed for rights management. PREMIS rights is limited to permission actions taken within the repository. These data will be recorded and stored in other metadata schema outside of your preservation repository. PREMIS is the best standard we have for preservation metadata and is recommended as the practical way to implement metadata for digital archives and preservation.
Resources mentioned in this special topic are available from the Library of Congress PREMIS Maintenance Activity website, the Data Dictionary 3.0, and Kaplan Understanding PREMIS from 2017.
Thanks for watching this special topic on PREMIS. I hope you found this helpful for developing your digital archives and digital preservation programs.